Hey guys, it's Meya. Welcome back to the channel, and thanks for being part of this wild manhwa journey with me. Now, let's dive into today's story. Soon after, the students made their way to the training grounds where instructor Diego Sanchez, their swordsmanship teacher, was already waiting. Before Rowan could make sense of what was happening, his classmates bolted toward the instructor, eager to impress. What shocked him more was how they used mana while doing it. Excited by the discovery that his classmates could manipulate mana too, Rowan joined the sprint. Despite starting late, he overtook every single student, effortlessly speed-blitzing the group with such fluid motion that even Sophie was stunned. His body moved like a blur. Even the instructor, watching from afar, was taken aback. How could such a small boy move that fast? By the end of the run, Rowan was still energetic while his classmates panted in exhaustion. Sophie, meanwhile, couldn't take her eyes off him. To her, he didn't even seem human. When he asked if she enjoyed the race, she could only stare in disbelief, internally convinced that the boy was some kind of demon. Once everyone had caught their breath, Diego formally introduced himself as their instructor and master of swordsmanship. The students groaned when asked to pick up wooden practice swords, still winded from the earlier run. But Rowan didn't move. His feet were rooted to the ground, his gaze fixed on the swords. Diego noticed immediately. The hesitation wasn't from fatigue, it was fear. The image of Blake's blade still haunted Rowan. Sensing this, Diego knelt beside him and spoke softly, explaining that a sword was merely a tool, its intentions did not matter. It merely reflected the person who wielded it. That resonated with Rowan. He realized that if Blake had used a staff instead of a sword, he'd likely fear staffs instead. It wasn't the object, it was the trauma. And trauma wasn't truth. Summoning his courage, Rowan approached the rack and picked up a wooden sword. He didn't wish to be a swordmaster, but that didn't mean he should run away either. Diego watched him closely. His stance, though raw, showed natural talent. But his willpower? That still needed work. The students were then assigned to spar in pairs. Rowan was paired with Sophie, a decision that surprised them both. The others murmured, placing bets on Sophie. After all, she came from a noble family known for swordsmanship. Rowan, meanwhile, had just barely touched a wooden blade. At Diego's signal, the match began. Sophie moved first, her stance sharp and practiced. To Rowan, it was his first time witnessing true swordsmanship, not the violence of Blake's blade, but something controlled, purposeful. He admired it, even as she lunged at him. He responded with a perfectly neutral stance, one so precise it shocked even Diego and Sophie. Where had he learned that? Rowan didn't know. He was simply listening to the blade, his body reacting naturally. Sophie pressed forward, but Rowan's reflexes were uncanny. He dodged her attacks as if he knew exactly where she would strike. Again and again, he avoided her blows until Sophie found herself on the defensive, frustrated that every move was being predicted. It felt to her like Rowan could see the future. Finally, she dropped her sword and admitted defeat. But with a grin, she asked for a rematch. Rowan agreed, and by the end of 4 matches, they were evenly tied, 2 wins each. Their rivalry had begun. Later, the students were told their next class would cover basic magic. Most were relieved, finally a chance to rest. But Rowan looked puzzled. Wasn't magic the most important class for becoming a union member? He asked aloud. That drew shocked looks. One student explained that learning magic was near impossible in their class because their teacher was simply too powerful. Rowan frowned. Learning magic was never meant to be easy. Still, now he was even more curious about who their instructor was. That's when he heard the name, Professor Arthur. Not just a teacher. A former commander. The Dean of Magic at the Union Academy. Rowan was stunned. When magic class began, Professor Arthur arrived, dignified, composed, and radiating dense mana. Rowan immediately sensed it. Arthur's mana was even heavier than Director Lazarus's. Now he really wanted to know who the strongest in the Union was. Arthur addressed the class and welcomed the new student. He explained that while most found his lessons tedious, he respected Rowan's desire to become a mage. Hearing this, Rowan's spirit lifted. Arthur smiled, but reminded him, this was a deviation from the swordsmanship path. That's when Rowan realized why his classmates had looked at him so strangely before. He asked aloud, why is pursuing magic seen so differently? Arthur let Sophie answer. She explained that mastery of magic required immense knowledge of theory, symbols, principles, and the self. It placed tremendous pressure on both the body and the mind. Even with talent, one couldn't become a recognized mage without years, sometimes decades, of study. Arthur nodded in agreement. Becoming a union mage after graduation was incredibly rare. Rowan sulked slightly. He had hoped becoming a first-class mage would be enough. Now he understood it wouldn't be. But even so, he wasn't discouraged. He was ready to try. To become an officially recognized and active mage, Rowan learned, one needed to reach at least second-class magic. That revelation only hardened his resolve. He quietly set a goal for himself, to reach third-class magic before graduation. A bold declaration. One so ambitious it stunned even Professor Arthur. The professor knew full well the boy likely didn't grasp what third-class magic truly entailed, but the sheer conviction in Rowan's eyes was impossible to ignore. To guide him, Arthur began the class by writing on the board. He explained the foundational differences between swordsmanship and magic in the Union. Swordsmanship, he said, was the Union's pride, a tradition of discipline and force. Magic, on the other hand, was the pursuit of wisdom, of deep knowledge. He then scribbled an elaborate formula onto the board, a theoretical construct meant to conjure a simple fire arrow. Even as students squinted at the board, struggling to understand, Rowan's expression darkened. He had seen this formula before. Not in a textbook, but near a ritual pit. That memory unsettled him. Arthur didn't expect the students to catch what was wrong with the formula. Despite its complexity, the fire arrow was considered a basic beginner's spell. Advanced spells, he warned, demanded exponentially more precision. With a steady hand, Arthur demonstrated. A glowing arrow of fire burst to life in the air. The class watched in awe, except Rowan, who noticed something strange. The arrow wavered slightly, its form unstable. It looked like it could dissipate at any moment. Arthur confirmed Rowan's suspicion. Magic formulas were finicky, even the tiniest miscalculation could ruin a spell, no matter how much mana was poured into it. To emphasize the point, he added a missing variable to the formula. This time the arrow didn't just stabilize, it grew in size and intensity, casting flickering shadows across the walls. The class gasped. Arthur explained that mages were expected to memorize these formulas, tweaking and perfecting them over years. It took inhuman patience to refine a spell. Turning an arrow into a fireball, for example, would require more mana and tax the body and mind. Magic, unlike swordsmanship, had steep limitations. Sophie chimed in, adding that channeling mana into a blade was simpler, more efficient. Casting a spell required much more energy, and far more control. Arthur nodded and elaborated that a mage's true strength depended on their mana reserves. The larger the pool, the more spells one could sustain. Rowan's heart sank. His mana concentration was low. It explained why spellcasting left him so drained. But he wasn't discouraged. He believed that with deep study and careful method, he could compensate, somehow. Arthur posed a question, asking the students what was required to cast a spell. Rowan answered, a formula. The professor agreed, but added that in real battle, reciting or recalling formulas was impractical. That's why magic circles were developed, to embody formulas as visual, symbolic constructs. That caught Rowan's attention. He remembered the strange tattoos on the director's arms. They weren't decorative, they were magic circles. Arthur explained that some mages etched these symbols onto their bodies to speed up spell recall. If the formula was an equation, then the circle was its diagram. Then Rowan asked an astute follow-up, was chanting the linguistic translation of the formula? Arthur paused, impressed. That was a sophisticated observation. Rowan reasoned that the formula written on the board acted as a blueprint. If the circle was a symbol, then surely the spoken chant was the verbal translation of that blueprint. Arthur couldn't hide his pride. Even on his first day, Rowan had grasped a concept that often took years for mages to piece together. Yes, the professor confirmed. Chanting involved channeling mana through spoken language, intoning the correct words infused with energy, each syllable carrying weight. To demonstrate, he chanted slowly and conjured a massive fireball, larger and more refined than before. He explained that speed, tone, and even emotion influenced the outcome of a spell. Spellcasting wasn't just science, it was art. And Rowan had never been so captivated in his life. Arthur, however, worried that his detailed explanation might have overwhelmed the boy. But Rowan's eyes still sparkled with curiosity. He was more determined than ever. Pleased, Arthur declared that it was time for the real challenge to begin. The students would now study ancient magical languages, the roots of all formulae. Each student received a heavy, aged tome to begin deciphering. Groans erupted across the room. By the end of the session, Sophie looked like a ghost. The amount of homework was brutal, and she deeply regretted signing up for so many classes. Meanwhile, Rowan seemed unaffected. He had filled nearly his entire schedule with lectures and electives, barely leaving room for breaks. Sophie found it exhausting, and admittedly, a little annoying. Before leaving for the night, she learned that Rowan would be rooming with a student named Lucas. The name didn't ring any bells for him. She wished him good luck and disappeared into the corridor. Back in the dorm, Rowan sat alone under candlelight, decoding spells from his textbook. If his mana reserves were too low for traditional high-tier spells, he reasoned, perhaps he could develop spells suited to his limits. He began adjusting the formula from earlier, making tweaks and refinements. To his own shock, he succeeded. The spell activated. But it came at a cost. A massive wave of fatigue hit him like a blow to the chest. He barely had time to process what had happened before his body collapsed to the floor. Later that evening, Lucas returned to their shared room, only to find Rowan lying unconscious, surrounded by scorch marks and open books. Panic seized him.
The boy was barely breathing.
As Rowan drifted in a dreamlike haze, he heard a familiar voice. It was Lady Sienna, whispering softly, full of guilt. She wondered if they had all asked too much of him, her, Arthur, even Oscar. He was a gifted child, yes. But still a child. When Rowan finally opened his eyes, Lucas was hovering over him, equal parts relieved and flustered. Lucas introduced himself properly, Lucas von Passau, his assigned roommate. He seemed overjoyed that Rowan had woken up. Apparently, he had been personally assigned to look after the boy, by none other than his own father, Vice Captain Oscar. That part caught Rowan off guard. Lucas joked that he was under strict orders to ensure Rowan didn't burn the dorm down. His manner radiated trust, and Rowan found himself instinctively comfortable around him. Despite looking older, Lucas admitted he was actually just 2 years ahead, a classmate who had failed his entrance qualifications twice. He wasn't a bookworm, but he was talented at swordsmanship, following in his father's footsteps. Rowan, however, couldn't help but notice something else. Lucas's mana density was impressive, far greater than most students. His build, too, was strong, his presence grounded. And yet, he had flunked twice. Lucas teased him for pushing himself too hard. Even after collapsing, Rowan still wanted to attend class the next day. The older boy shook his head and insisted they skip just this once. They'd get some fresh air, eat something warm, and take the edge off. After some playful back and forth, Rowan finally agreed. Jokingly, he called Lucas a clown for failing twice. Lucas shot back that even stepping on a Lego was a valid reason to skip a test, and that was a critical injury, thank you very much. The two laughed. By the next scene, Rowan was bundled up and following Lucas to their self-declared flunking session. But not before Lucas made sure the kid ate enough to refuel. After all, casting your first fireball was a rite of passage. Even if it knocked you out cold. As they wandered through the Union streets, Rowan suddenly felt something strange, a faint trace of mana in the air. He paused, alert. Intrigued, he insisted they check it out. Lucas, ever easygoing, agreed, and they soon found themselves standing before a small magic shop. The moment they stepped inside, Rowan's eyes widened. Almost every object in the store radiated traces of mana, some faint, some sharp, some chaotic. It was like walking into a room full of whispers, each magical item humming its own forgotten song. Meanwhile, Lucas, the vice captain's son, was losing a battle with dust, sneezing uncontrollably. Then came a rude awakening for Rowan. He was broke. Completely and utterly broke. Not even a coin left over from the shelter. He slumped in defeat, silently berating himself for not keeping a single spare coin. Lucas noticed his sulking and offered to cover anything Rowan needed, saying it was part of his duty, his father's orders. A generous gesture. A real homie move, Rowan thought. But Rowan, true to form, had the instincts of a world-class cheapskate. He jokingly asked for everything in the store. Lucas chuckled and showed him the few coins he had. It wasn't much, but it was enough for something. Rowan set off to find an item that didn't break his friend's budget. As he explored, something caught his eye, an object that pulsed with a murky, dangerous kind of mana. It was an egg-shaped stone etched with a complex magic circle. Surprisingly, it was priced low. The shopkeeper approached and explained that the object was known as the Stone of Guatia, though most people just used it as decoration. Supposedly, it housed a creature, sealed away long ago, but it had never hatched. Over time, the item had become little more than a curiosity. Rowan asked what was inside. The shopkeeper admitted that he had no idea, no one did. According to legend, the stone was a cage, not just an egg, but the creature inside had never revealed itself. The seller had only kept it because it looked interesting, but it had long since been dismissed as useless. Despite that, Rowan was curious. He could tell from the markings that the magic circle sealing it was expert level, far more complicated than the formula for a simple fireball. The craftsmanship alone piqued his interest. He turned to Lucas for a second opinion. Lucas, ever the brawler, grinned and said it was definitely more exciting than a book, and hey, it could probably crack someone's skull open if used right. Rowan laughed and made his decision. He would take the egg. With their strange new purchase in hand, the pair left the shop. Evening was falling, but Lucas wasn't done yet. He wanted the day to end with a bang. So he took Rowan to the clock tower, the most iconic place in the entire Union. Rowan was speechless. The tower stretched impossibly high into the sky, majestic and ancient. It wasn't just beautiful, it was powerful. Lucas explained that the clock tower was where the governor and commander of the Union resided. He'd only seen the former commander once, as a child. When Rowan asked what the man looked like, Lucas could only describe him as a white swan among crows, a majestic figure in a brilliant white suit surrounded by dark-robed subordinates. That metaphor stuck with Rowan. He realized how little he knew about the true hierarchy of the Union. He was familiar with the ranks in theory, but hearing Lucas describe them added a new weight. A 7th-rank captain, considered an expert, could defend an entire city single-handedly. But above them stood the commander, a man so powerful he could rival an entire nation. And above even him the governor, who held the highest rank on the continent, equal to a king. Standing beneath the towering spire, Rowan felt the sheer distance between where he was and where he wanted to be. But it didn't discourage him. If anything, it fueled his ambition. One day, he vowed, he would stand among them. As the sky darkened and stars emerged, Rowan remained captivated by the tower. Its upper sections were visible even from the school, so vast and tall it seemed to pierce the sky. He noticed something peculiar, the clock hands. The red ones. What did they indicate? He turned to Lucas and asked how to read them. Lucas scratched his head and squinted like he was trying to decipher ancient runes. After a moment, he admitted with a laugh that he had never learned to read analog clocks. Rowan pieced it together on his own. The red characters on the outer band, he deduced, were from ancient languages. They indicated the year, and right now, the clock read 262. From there, he traced the indicators for the month, day, and time. It was June 14th, 262, 7:20 p.m. But that wasn't what stunned him. He had seen this tower before, not in real life, but in a vision shown to him by the mysterious tree. In that illusion, the clock tower had been the centerpiece of destruction. The clock hands in the vision had also pointed to June 14th, but in the year 272. Exactly 10 years from now. Later, after they returned to their dorm, Lucas picked up his wooden sword and left to train. No matter how lazy he seemed in class, he never skipped a day of sword practice. Even one missed day made him feel sluggish. Rowan was left alone with his thoughts. The vision haunted him. What if it wasn't just an illusion, but a premonition?
A glimpse of the future?
To make sense of it, he closed his eyes and opened his mind palace, an inner realm where his perfect memory could replay every detail. First, he reconstructed every image he'd stored of the tower. Then, step by step, he compared the real world to the vision. He catalogued rooftops, structures, even corpses. He remembered a fallen runner who had died beneath a collapsed building. Carefully, he pieced it all together. Then came the hardest part. He brought forth the memory of that grim future and enhanced it, filling in gaps and aligning each moment in order. And as he looked deeper into that scene, he saw something he had tried to avoid until now: his friends, lifeless and older. Sophie, Lucas, Senior Sienna, all of them dead. It struck him like a blade to the chest. That was the future he wanted to change. And then he looked at himself. He scrolled through the frames, searching for a clear image of his future self. In one, he finally found it: Rowan standing amid rubble. But the angle didn't show his badge or rank. Unwilling to give up, he dove even deeper into the reconstructed vision, rotating the image within his mind until he could see from a different perspective. There it was. His heart froze. Future Rowan stood there, bloodied and broken. His chest was torn open, a gaping wound where his heart should have been. The body was hollow, mangled. He was already dead. After enduring the mentally exhausting reconstruction of his vision, Rowan finally pulled himself out of the nightmare. Slowly, he opened his eyes and sat in silence, lost in thought. He began to wonder if the vision had been a warning, some kind of cryptic message from the tree. If it were true, the fall of the Union would spell disaster not just for the kingdom but for the entire continent.
The death of civilization.
Humanity's extinction. What troubled him even more was the nature of the tree itself. From what he understood, it was formed through dark magic, a twisted creation extracted from human mana and shaped by sacrificial souls who had hovered between life and death. Amid the horrific visions, Rowan recalled another ominous detail: a hooded figure lurking in the chaos. Perhaps that mysterious individual held the key to understanding the nightmare's truth. Though Rowan remained skeptical about the illusion's validity, he knew he couldn't take any chances. If there was even a slim possibility that the vision foretold the future, he needed to do something, anything, to change it. The best place to start, he thought, was with himself. The version of him in that vision had worn the Union's signature black suit. If that path led to death, then perhaps avoiding the Union entirely could divert the future. Maybe joining the Management Bureau, whose members wore red, could steer him away from that fate. Or maybe he could reach for something far more ambitious: the white suit, the garb worn only by the commander. If he could rise to that level before the 10 years passed, perhaps he could outpace destiny. The next morning arrived, and the roommates prepared for their return to campus after taking the previous day off. Before leaving, Lucas reminded Rowan that Professor Daphne had requested to meet with him before classes resumed. After delivering the message, Lucas went on ahead. Rowan couldn't help but wonder what Daphne wanted to discuss. After donning his uniform, he made his way to the faculty office, where the professor greeted him kindly and asked how he was feeling after his recent health scare. Rowan had heard from Lucas that Professor Daphne had submitted his case for medical leave, ensuring it wouldn't affect his records. She seemed genuinely concerned that the boy might have taken on too much, warning that his schedule, overflowing with elective classes, was more than most first years could handle. She gently encouraged him to consider scaling back, but Rowan was resolute. He had no intention of slowing down. In fact, he was excited to attend the classes he hadn't yet been able to join. Daphne, feeling partially responsible for the pressure he'd placed on himself, listened quietly as Rowan reassured her that such an incident wouldn't happen again. Before dismissing him, she reminded him one last time to reach out if he ever needed help. Rowan thanked her sincerely and headed off to his first period. These days, cultivating mana had become second nature for Rowan, like breathing. Training no longer consumed much of his time. But now he had a new goal: to help his friends grow alongside him. He didn't want to walk this path alone, especially if the future held danger for all of them. As soon as he entered the classroom, a wave of concerned gazes met him. His classmates had heard about his collapse and were clearly worried. Their support strengthened his determination. If he could help them become stronger, capable, maybe they would all survive what lay ahead. Rowan cleared his throat and called for everyone's attention. First he named those who had always leaned toward magic: Isidore, Mirka, Lean, Kirsten, Edwin, Darien, Tick and Ketos, students who had no interest in swordsmanship. Then he turned to the opposite group: Flora, Sebastian, Aona, Deus, Sabrina, Wella, and of course Lucas, those who had never once stepped into a magic class. What surprised many was not the message, but the fact that Rowan remembered all their names. Even Sophie seemed curious about why he had brought this up so suddenly. Rowan explained that he simply wanted everyone to try both disciplines, magic and swordsmanship. He admitted that he might be asking too much, but he hoped they could keep an open mind. The girls were quickly swayed by his charm. The boys were more reluctant, worried about piling on more coursework. Rather than argue, Rowan decided to show them instead. He asked Lucas, the last person anyone would expect in a magic lecture, to attend just one session. Moved by Rowan's sincerity, even the skeptics couldn't say no. Something about him made it difficult to refuse. That day, Professor Arthur, the Dean of Magic Studies, stepped into a lecture hall filled to the brim. Every seat was taken. Rumor had it that Rowan was the reason behind the surge in attendance. Arthur felt a spark of energy stir within him at the sight. Rowan simply wanted his peers to see that magic wasn't distant or untouchable, it was real, and it was powerful. When Arthur asked what he planned to show, Rowan requested permission to take the stage. The professor chuckled and waved him forward. Lucas, now seated beside Sophie, wasn't sure whether to be proud or embarrassed by his roommate's boldness. Meanwhile, outside the lecture hall, something unusual was happening. Several high-ranking figures had gathered just beyond the doors. Professor Daphne noted the presence of Director Lazarus, one of the busiest men in the Union, and suspected his visit had something to do with Rowan. Lazarus confirmed that the boy was part of the reason, though overseeing the school was also part of his job. Alongside them stood Sienna Runner, who had dropped by on her day off at the request of Vice Captain Oscar. More surprisingly, Mr. Diego, a master of swordsmanship, had shown up out of pure curiosity. He'd heard that one of his freshman swordsmen was attending magic class and had decided to investigate. Accompanying them was the principal himself, tagging along with Lazarus out of interest. Daphne, seeing the odd assembly of powerful guests, urged them not to disrupt the class. They agreed to simply observe. But the moment she opened the door, she was greeted by a blast of heat. A crimson flare hovered in the air, burning with a precise, controlled fury. Rowan stood at the center of it, radiant with joy and awe as if seeing magic for the first time. Arthur had raised a barrier just in time to protect the students. He stared, astonished. A fireball? That wasn't a spell a first year should be able to use. Even the simpler fire arrow spell wasn't typically mastered until the 5th year, and only by gifted students. So how had this small, seemingly unassuming boy conjured such an advanced spell? Even the guests were stunned. The principal focused on the fireball, noting its refined energy and impossibly stable form. To him, it resembled the quality of holy magic, something divine. Diego, though a swordsman, could tell the spell's density was unnatural. Lazarus quietly murmured that it defied common sense. Yes, fireball was technically categorized as a simple spell in the grand scheme of magic. But this wasn't just a fireball. The flame held its shape, its temperature, and its size with unwavering consistency. What Rowan had conjured was something new. Something beyond ordinary magic. Sienna stood among the onlookers, silently captivated by the vivid flare dancing in the center of the lecture hall. She had witnessed Rowan's extraordinary mana sense up close before, but seeing him control magic with such grace in front of an audience left her breathless. How could a boy who had grown up in a corrupt, decrepit relief shelter command such beautiful, refined magic? Snapping out of her trance, she gently reminded the other faculty members that Rowan had only just recovered from a medical incident. She worried he might not be fully healed, and suggested they avoid pushing the child too far with his performance. But despite her concern, no one in the room wanted to interrupt such a mesmerizing display. It was difficult, even for experienced mages, to bring themselves to halt something so beautiful. Meanwhile, Rowan was focused inward. As the fire hovered midair, he continued to supply it with mana, carefully regulating its flow. His technique prioritized consistency and control over sheer power or scale. One wrong move could destabilize the flame, but he had it under perfect command. Still, Rowan's attention wasn't fully on the fireball anymore. He had grown curious about the barrier spell Dean Arthur had cast to protect the students. The shimmering shield reminded him of the bottomless pit from his nightmare, similar in shape, yet clearly different in purpose. He briefly wondered what would happen if the fireball were to strike the barrier. Shaking off the intrusive thought, he turned to the professor and praised the barrier's structure, politely asking its name. Arthur, momentarily stunned, forgot to answer. It was hard to believe that the boy could hold a conversation so casually while sustaining a high-level spell. Maintaining a fireball for this long demanded serious focus. Yet Rowan acted as if it were a simple parlor trick. Not wanting to let things escalate further, Arthur finally acted. With a wave of his hand, he bent and manipulated the barrier's form until it enveloped the flame entirely, snuffing it out in a single elegant motion. There was no protest from Rowan, only admiration. He had just witnessed a masterclass in control and spell artistry. As the flame vanished, the class collectively exhaled, realizing they'd been holding their breath the entire time. Arthur turned to Rowan, unable to decide whether to scold the boy or commend him for breaking every rule in the textbook. Before he could speak, Director Lazarus walked confidently onto the stage, his bald head gleaming under the hall's lighting. Applauding loudly, he addressed Rowan with a smile and answered the earlier question. The barrier spell was Arthur's signature technique, known as the Azure Flame Barrier. Rowan turned to his professor and grinned, commenting on how cool the name was. Arthur downplayed it, claiming he hadn't chosen the name himself. Still, Rowan insisted it was a perfect title for a brilliant creation. Since they were now discussing names, Arthur asked Rowan if his own fiery display had a name. The boy hesitated, insisting it was just a fireball, nothing special. But everyone in the room, at least those with a basic understanding of magic, knew otherwise. Arthur raised a brow, and Rowan eventually averted his gaze, admitting that he might have been playing dumb. Even so, he hadn't thought about naming the spell yet. Before Arthur could deliver a lecture about the dangers of such magic, Rowan's mind was already spinning with the possibilities of a new name. At that moment, Director Lazarus cut in. As head of the bureau, he couldn't simply overlook what had just occurred. He asked Rowan why he had performed such a risky spell at the end of his demonstration. Rowan answered without hesitation. He had full confidence in his control, and more importantly, he trusted Professor Arthur to step in if anything went wrong. He hadn't done it to show off, he simply wanted his classmates to feel excited about magic. Some of them, he believed, might be too afraid to even try it. He just wanted to help change that. Arthur stepped in to support Rowan's point. Mastering Fireball before graduation was already considered exceptional. What did that make a freshman who had just redefined the parameters of the spell entirely? Rowan's optimism was infectious. But what he didn't realize was that this wasn't normal. He truly had no idea how much of a prodigy he was. Arthur, as an educator, began to feel a twinge of shame. Had he been limiting the next generation by pushing rigid standards and assumptions? This small boy had just shattered those with one spell. Then Rowan turned to Arthur and humbly asked if he could show one more thing. There was still something he wanted to demonstrate for his classmates. The professor granted his request, curious to see what the boy would do next. To everyone's surprise, Rowan called his roommate, Lucas, up to the podium. The swordsman hesitated, bewildered by the sudden attention. As he climbed onto the stage, he wondered if he'd somehow become Rowan's test subject. Rowan, brimming with excitement, explained that he had recently helped Lucas cast his first spell. In his view, swordsmanship and magic were just two different ways of controlling mana. Since Lucas trained his body and mana every day, he should be able to cross into magical territory too. There was just one problem: Lucas had never studied magic theory, not even once. Rowan suggested starting with something simpler, like an incantation. A verbal spell, he believed, would be more intuitive for a beginner than complex formulas or magic circles. So, Rowan began slowly reciting a fiery incantation in the old tongue. Lucas tried to follow along, but the pronunciation tripped him up. Rowan, ever patient, continued encouraging him. But despite his enthusiasm, they couldn't even get through the first sentence. Rowan had expected Lucas, who'd repeated his freshman year 3 times, to at least have some exposure to ancient language basics. Apparently not. Still, Rowan didn't give up. He decided to translate the incantation into modern speech to help Lucas understand its meaning, what the spell was truly trying to bring into the world. He turned the words into a poem, its cadence unusual but poetic. Lucas cringed at the idea of reciting something so old-fashioned, but Rowan pressed on, eyes scanning the classroom for any signs of understanding. But as he continued, confusion swept across the room. His classmates stared blankly, even Sophie looked lost. That's when doubt hit him. He had thought he could just walk up and share his knowledge, lead them forward. But it seemed they couldn't even follow his first steps. A sense of helplessness gripped him. If they were this lost now, how could they possibly survive the future he had seen? For a moment, he froze. Lucas noticed and grew concerned. Sensing the tension, Dean Arthur stepped in to save the moment. He applauded Rowan for his initiative and praised the effort, calling it an impressive first attempt. To shift the focus, he asked Rowan if he could share the spell formula behind the modified incantation. That question reignited Rowan's spark. He lifted a piece of chalk telekinetically, drawing gasps from the class, and began sketching out an elaborate spell matrix across the board. His control and ease with mana manipulation continued to impress. This time, Arthur activated his barrier again, but with a twist. It now protected the stage instead of the audience. Lazarus and Arthur both leaned forward, studying the complex diagram forming on the chalkboard. When they asked where he had seen the formula, Rowan calmly explained that he hadn't copied it. He had seen what Professor Arthur wrote the other day and simply adapted it. It was more suited to his style that way. The truth, however, was staggering. He hadn't just tweaked a spell, he'd created an entirely new formula. Lazarus and Arthur exchanged a glance, the kind that meant a serious meeting was in order. Before departing, Lazarus sincerely thanked Rowan for sharing his groundbreaking spell. Arthur, meanwhile, turned to the dark elf beside him and asked her name. With a crisp salute, she replied, "Sienna of the Pillar of Faith." Just as the tension began to settle, Dean Arthur suddenly handed over the remaining hours of the lecture to Sienna. She was free to teach whatever she liked, whether it be theory, self-study, or even basic swordsmanship, as long as the students remained safe. To make matters worse, Professor Diego, without a second thought, passed off his next class to her as well. Sienna had merely been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and now she was left to manage an entire lecture hall of restless first years. Before leaving, Arthur dispelled the barrier that had been shielding the adults from the students, and the remaining faculty members filed out, heading toward a meeting of serious importance. That left Sienna, a field soldier not a teacher, with a crowd of wide-eyed kids who were still murmuring excitedly about Rowan's earlier demonstration. With a sharp slam of her hand on the desk, she brought immediate silence to the room. That single action was enough to jolt most of them to attention. Introducing herself formally as Sienna of the Pillar of Faith, she declared that she would be temporarily taking over the lecture as an acting professor, and she expected every student to treat it as an official class. Despite her composed demeanor, internally she felt completely out of her depth. This wasn't what she was trained for. Sienna was a battlefield asset, not a classroom lecturer. Elsewhere, the faculty gathered behind closed doors in a rare emergency session. Some of the younger professors looked visibly anxious. The emergency response committee hadn't been activated in years. For a few, this was their first time even hearing about it. Director Lazarus, ever composed, opened the meeting with the primary agenda, the implications of Rowan's recent performance and what it meant for Union Academy's education policy. Dean Arthur stepped forward to recount the incident. He explained that Rowan, a mere freshman, had interpreted and executed a complex spell in an entirely novel way. The fireball had not been strong, but it had been customized enough to be considered a new spell entirely. What stunned him wasn't just the boy's power, it was his ability to reconstruct and personalize a spell formula freely. In all his years, Arthur admitted, he had never seen anything quite like it. Naturally, skepticism followed. Some professors found it difficult to believe. But with Arthur already having verified the spell, there wasn't much room for denial. Lazarus then pledged the Bureau's support to conduct further analysis. Regardless of outcomes, the Academy had to recognize that Rowan might have stumbled upon a new conceptual approach to magic. This sparked a debate. Some faculty members argued that Rowan should receive age-appropriate education, following the standard curriculum like everyone else. Others insisted that a genius of his caliber needed specialized training. However, implementing personalized education ran contrary to Union Academy's public ethos. They couldn't afford to mishandle such a rare talent, but neither could they break precedent lightly. One professor suggested fast-tracking Rowan's entry into the Union itself, a proposal that received immediate pushback. Eventually, the conversation shifted to the question of Rowan's personality. Arthur hesitated, then shared his concerns. While Rowan was undoubtedly polite and well-meaning, the dean feared that the boy might lack emotional sensitivity, an issue that could hinder him when working in teams or taking the union's final evaluation, which included a character interview. Some defended the child, asserting that his intentions had been good. He simply lacked awareness. But the truth was clear, Rowan was developing at a rate far beyond his peers, and the gap was only growing. Since no consensus was forming, Lazarus suggested they bring Rowan in for a direct conversation. Shortly after, Rowan was ushered into the room and seated at the long, intimidating faculty table. Professor Daphne offered him a warm smile and asked how he was feeling. She guessed he might still be upset over what happened with Lucas earlier, and she was right. Rowan admitted that he had felt frustrated. He didn't fully understand his friend's capabilities and had assumed too much. Teaching magic, he now realized, was far harder than he thought. He then shared a few developing thoughts. Some students, he said, might have caught glimpses of the earlier demonstration during break time. Perhaps Lucas never gave magic a fair chance. Maybe he had picked up a sword too early in life and trained only that path. Rowan feared that he might have pushed his friend into something he wasn't meant for. He expressed regret, even going so far as to worry that his classmates, Lucas included, might be sick. The faculty was momentarily confused until they realized Rowan wasn't being cruel. He simply had a warped perception of normal talent compared to his own. Arthur reassured him that there was no illness involved, just difference. That seemed to ease Rowan's burden. Seeing the boy smile again, Director Lazarus leaned in and asked why Rowan was so determined to teach everyone magic. Rowan responded honestly, it wasn't just about magic. He wanted to grow stronger together with his new friends so they could all join the union side by side. The sincerity in his voice melted away any lingering doubts about his character. Professor Daphne looked at him with quiet pride. With that, the meeting concluded, and Rowan was dismissed to rest. In the following hours, sweeping changes were set in motion. Revised papers flew across desks, and a new education strategy for first years was formalized. The plan? Match students' academic pace to that of the highest performers, while aligning emotional and social growth expectations with the average. Union Academy was evolving. By the very next morning, the curriculum changes had gone into effect. Out on the training field, Professor Diego made the announcement, from now on, both swordsmanship and magic would be mandatory for all students. Lucas missed most of the announcement through the fog of his yawns. Rowan, however, was stunned by how fast the academy had responded. On top of that, active union members would now be joining every class as assistant instructors, providing real-world experience and field insights to the students. Additionally, Rowan, Lucas, and Sophie were placed in a special training rotation, sparring against each other exclusively to push their development even further. Lucas was thrilled. He'd been itching for a chance to properly test his roommate. Sophie was equally excited. She was eager to see how her swordsmanship would fare against two of the best. Lucas wasted no time challenging Rowan. Sophie called dibs on the next round. When her turn came, however, the duel was short-lived. Her wooden sword was knocked from her hand almost instantly. She had hoped to hold her ground, but now she realized how wide the gap truly was. Rowan could read her every move like an open book. Still, she wasn't the type to give up. Seeing a fleeting opportunity, she attempted a counter but couldn't follow through. With more practice, she believed she could improve. Shaking off the loss, she approached Rowan with a respectful handshake. She then asked if he'd noticed any glaring weaknesses in her technique. Rowan, speaking casually, said that her mana flow was slightly misaligned. If she could learn to adjust the direction of the flow, she would likely see improvement very quickly. Sophie nodded, determination hardening in her eyes. Lucas had casually chimed in after Rowan's feedback to Sophie, bluntly suggesting that she stop swinging her sword around so wildly and focus on control and precision instead. He added that her legs sometimes wobbled, likely due to a lack of core strength. Though Lucas's delivery was harsh, Rowan admitted he wasn't entirely wrong. Still, he noted, Lucas's assessment didn't paint the full picture. Rowan explained that Sophie was currently distributing her mana evenly between her upper and lower body, an inefficient 50-50th split. If she could divert slightly more mana to her lower body, her stance would stabilize dramatically. While Rowan offered insightful critique, Lucas tossed in his usual round of jabs and half-serious insults. Professor Diego watched the trio interact with amusement. These were his top students, bickering, bantering, and bettering each other in their own way. And yet, Arthur had expressed concerns about Rowan's personality. Watching the boy laugh with his friends, Diego felt such worries were likely unfounded. A few days later, Professor Daphne invited Rowan to her office for a quiet chat. She had played a vital role in supporting his adjustment to academy life. Rowan, once burdened by his worries over his friends, now carried himself with a lighter heart. He had grown closer to his classmates, learning to appreciate both their strengths and their flaws. Daphne was pleased. Rowan had finally started to understand empathy. School life was treating him well, his friends cheered him on and occasionally spoiled him with snacks. Of course, there were moments of confusion too, mostly involving girls. Some had begun inviting him to outings that puzzled him: shopping trips, flower viewing sessions, even casual walks after class. None of it seemed related to studies. Daphne chuckled at Rowan's awkwardness. He was, after all, entering that age when romantic interests began to bloom. Most times, Rowan's go-to response to these invitations was to suggest a study session instead. Daphne affectionately called it lethal nerd energy. She gently shifted the conversation and asked if there were any girls he felt particularly close to. Rowan's mind immediately turned to Sophie. She was different from the others, strong, competent, and one of the only other first years capable of generating flame. Recently, he had grown even closer to her. He had learned about her difficult circumstances. Sophie was the illegitimate daughter of the prestigious Pobel family. Her enrollment in the union was less about personal ambition and more about fulfilling a diplomatic obligation. She was constantly under pressure due to the conditions of her birth. To Rowan, Sophie was more than a friend, she was someone he deeply respected. There was much he could learn from her. Then, of course, there was Lucas. Their trio had become inseparable. Rowan admired Lucas's physical strength, though he also believed the boy was a bit of a musclehead. Over time, he had formed a theory about his roommate. Lucas had trained with his sword so obsessively that his brain had developed into a mass of pure brawn, leaving little room for academics. Rowan even imagined a distorted brain map for Lucas, one that might actually be biologically plausible, if absurd. He added that Lucas couldn't even read clocks. Daphne stared at him, unnerved but no longer surprised. Genius, she had learned, often came with peculiar thought patterns. Rowan shared that he had been helping Lucas with his studies, determined not to let him flunk out of first year. In his mind, that was what being a good person looked like. After that meeting, Rowan paid a visit to Dean Arthur. He wanted to discuss his constitution. Despite his natural brilliance and affinity for both combat and magic, his physical body lagged far behind. Rowan admitted it might sound greedy, but he wished to wield stronger magic, and for that, he needed a sturdier foundation. Arthur explained the options. One route involved magic tools, items that could amplify mana or store powerful spells. But tools of such quality were rare and expensive. Most mass-produced ones were weak, disposable, or unstable, unsuitable for the kind of magic Rowan aimed to develop. The second route involved elixirs, special tinctures capable of enhancing the mana pool, alleviating physical deficiencies, and boosting constitution overall. These came in many forms and were extremely rare. Arthur mentioned Reilly's fruit as an example, an item so potent it was heavily trafficked in black markets. Even if Rowan managed to get his hands on an elixir, there was no guarantee it would work. Still, he remained hopeful. Arthur then removed the necklace around his neck and handed it to Rowan. Inside the locket was a white pill, an elixir he had once received as a reward from the governor for a mission long past. Perhaps, Arthur mused, this was meant for someone like Rowan all along. Rowan hesitated. It felt wrong to accept something so valuable. But Arthur insisted. He couldn't use it himself, and he wanted to invest in the boy's future. With a deep breath, Rowan took the pill. He swallowed it dry, without hesitation. Almost instantly, his body began to react. He felt as though he were floating, his own mana spreading like warm oil through every fiber of his being. The elixir was working, until suddenly, the feeling vanished. When he opened his eyes, he was still seated in Arthur's office. Judging by his disappointed look, Arthur assumed the worst. Rowan confirmed it, the pill had no effect. Arthur hadn't expected a miracle, but even he was disheartened. Rowan, however, remained unfazed. If he couldn't fix his body, he would reshape the magic world instead. He resolved to reconstruct and manipulate mana on a fundamental level, creating his own branch of magic, custom-built for his limitations. The visit hadn't been a waste. Now he had clarity. 6 months passed. The day of the freshman final exam in magic studies arrived. Rowan stood before a panel consisting of Dean Arthur and Director Lazarus. Without a word, he summoned 2 miniature fireballs, one in each hand. The panel watched, visibly impressed. He then made the flames rage and spiral, manipulating them with masterful control. They had seen many demonstrations, but Rowan's ability to directly handle mana remained a spectacle. Even so, Rowan worried that his fireballs were too weak to be of real use in Union missions. Arthur quickly dispelled his doubt. The mere fact that Rowan could cast without incantations placed him on par with a fourth-class mage. That, alone, was a feat. No one could question his qualifications. Now, he simply needed to focus on steady progress. Arthur then challenged him to analyze and recreate spells of the fourth class based on his own interpretation. To aid him, Rowan would be granted access to the ancient text stored in the administrative library. As for his constitution, they agreed it would remain a private matter. With only 3 of them in the room, Arthur and Lazarus formed a secret pact, a formal mage's oath sealed through clasped hands and incantation. Rowan, watching the scene unfold, simply assumed it was one of those old guy rituals. Another year flew by. Now in their 3rd year at Union Academy, Rowan and his friends found themselves facing new challenges. One day, Professor Diego called for an emergency faculty meeting. Though technically the matter fell within his authority, he believed it warranted collective input from his colleagues. The Academy had recently issued a surprising directive. Rowan would no longer be taught any movement techniques, martial arts, or swordsmanship involving the use of mana. The announcement stirred curiosity among students and faculty alike. Why now? Professor Diego addressed the concern. Everyone knew Rowan had made it abundantly clear, his ultimate goal was to join the Union. And now that he was in his 3rd year, it was time to minimize high-risk physical training. From this point forward, he should focus exclusively on magic. That, Diego explained, was not only what the boy wanted but what he needed most. Deep down, Diego knew this decision wasn't easy. Rowan was a rare talent, one any school would want to hoard. But stifling his growth for the sake of control was not an option. Letting go was the only way to do right by the future. Sienna, who had stepped into a teaching role after filling in over a year ago, raised a question. She asked about Rowan's current physical capabilities. Diego didn't hesitate. In his estimation, Rowan could pass the Union's first entrance test with ease, just by drawing his sword. He was that skilled. While his destructive output still lagged behind, that part would surely improve with time. The conversation shifted naturally toward Rowan's strength as a mage. Professor Daphne turned to Dean Arthur and asked for his assessment. Arthur was quiet for a moment. Then, with a tone of finality, he declared there was nothing more he could teach the boy. Rowan had already surpassed everything an old mage like him could offer. By now, Rowan could freely apply first and second-class magic and was already dissecting and reconstructing third-class formulas. To him, even complex magic structures felt like toys. He was a prodigy in every sense of the word, already a monster in the making, and just stepping into his 3rd year. He had even begun to grow taller. And with that growth spurt came attention. Female students swooned at the golden boy of Union Academy. Not that it mattered, Rowan's interests remained planted firmly in his books. The author, as some joked, had nerfed him into a one-track-minded academic. That day, the first 3rd-year lecture in magic studies passed without incident. As class ended, Dean Arthur called Rowan over. He wanted a private word about an upcoming event, a magic exchange tournament that would soon be held in collaboration with another institution. The prize? A scholarship, and more importantly, a chance to earn a rare elixir. Arthur explained that Rowan was the obvious choice to represent Union Academy. The boy, however, seemed surprised. He had never even heard of such an event before, not once in the past 3 years. The dean elaborated. The exchange used to be a platform for scholarly discourse in magic, but it had been discontinued as magic fell out of fashion. Its revival now was due to one thing, Rowan's existence. The very idea startled him. But it was true. Stories of Rowan's progress had traveled far, even reaching Schwerin, the only autonomous duchy remaining among the 7 kingdoms. At the heart of Schwerin stood the famed Magic Tower, a haven for arcane research. Its tower master also served as duke, and the region remained somewhat detached from the outside world. It wasn't hyperbole to say that Schwerin was the beating heart of modern magical advancement. Arthur himself had once trained there, earning the rank of 3rd-class Heil Mage before joining the Union. He understood their mindset well. The scholars of Schwerin were driven by one core desire, curiosity. That was their fuel. No one could say how much they knew about the Union, but they surely knew the surface-level facts. And by now, word had likely reached them about the boy some were calling a fourth-class mage. Rowan squirmed at that title. His spell manipulation was advanced, yes, but his raw firepower left much to be desired. It didn't sit right with him. Arthur, however, clarified the nature of the tournament. It was not a duel but a scholarly debate. Schwerin likely wanted to verify the Union's golden boy for themselves. Rowan briefly considered sitting this one out, until Arthur mentioned the reward. If he won, he'd receive an elixir. Even after last year's disappointment, the thought of another chance stirred something inside him. There was one lingering fear: had Schwerin somehow learned of his weakened constitution? Arthur dismissed the idea. They had no way of knowing. Besides, the debate wasn't about constitution, it was about magical theory. If Rowan could demonstrate his understanding and articulate his formulas well, the elixir would be his. In essence, Rowan could earn a priceless elixir just by winning an argument. How could he say no? A few days later, the day of the exchange arrived. The Union side was modest in number: Rowan, Dean Arthur, and a few staff. Schwerin, on the other hand, arrived in full force. Dozens of cloaked mages filed in like a silent army. Dean Arthur formally welcomed them, his tone calm and respectful. One of the visiting mages, a man named Bert, lowered his hood and greeted Arthur as a senior. It was an odd image, being a mage named Bert, but Rowan took note of the name all the same. He quietly sized up the competition. Schwerin's lineup was older, their magical aura potent. These weren't ordinary students, they were hand-picked disciples of Schwerin's Tower Master, hoping to learn from one of their kingdom's most successful alumni. Union Academy had brought just one student, Rowan. Schwerin brought 3. As always, they intended to overwhelm. To Arthur, it was petty but predictable. Schwerin still had something to prove. Even so, Rowan didn't mind. Facing 3 opponents would only make the victory more rewarding. When Bert introduced Union's sole representative, he feigned surprise. Meanwhile, behind the veneer of civility, the competitors exchanged silent stares, an unspoken tension charging the air. Rowan noticed one Schwerin student eyeing him cautiously. He responded with a smile. The boy immediately looked away, flustered. After a few formal handshakes, the two parties prepared for the competition hall, set to begin in the afternoon. By the time the spectators had gathered, the room buzzed with anticipation. Some younger students worried about Rowan. They feared he'd be overwhelmed. After all, he was going up against 3 seasoned opponents on his own. The girls in the crowd cheered with wild enthusiasm, nearly deafening Lucas, who sat nearby. Annoyed, he butted into their conversation to clarify, this wasn't a duel, it was a debate. But the girls fired back. Debates could be just as dangerous, they argued. Words could wound too. Lucas was more surprised that they even recognized him. Then again, being attached to Rowan's hip made him hard to miss. Beside him sat Sophie, who had also come to watch their friend kick some magical ass, with words. Professor Daphne stepped onto the podium to formally announce the beginning of the magic scholarly exchange. The girls from earlier hoisted a cloth banner with Rowan's name, waving it proudly. Hardly an appropriate gesture for an academic competition. At last, Rowan walked in, calm and composed. His 3 opponents followed. Daphne explained the rules. Each side would take turns proposing a topic, then present a spell formula in response. This would be followed by a Q&A session. The first representative from Schwerin was a young man named Ollie Marco, who would go up against Rowan. As the Union side had hosting rights, Rowan got to choose the opening topic. He didn't hesitate. Telekinesis. The Schwerin student seemed thrown off. Of all things, he had chosen a simple Class 1 spell to open the exchange. It was unorthodox. In most cases, participants would seize the first round to make a bold impression, demonstrating high-level magic to claim dominance. Instead, Union Academy's lone participant chose one of the most basic spells. Some muttered under their breath, wondering if the rumors had been overblown. They had crossed kingdoms, prepared to witness genius, only to be met with what they assumed was low-level drivel. But they were in for a surprise. Dean Arthur and Director Lazarus remained silent as Ol Marco, the Schwerin representative, scoffed at Rowan's choice of debate topic. He deemed telekinesis unworthy of serious discussion, considering it too basic for such a prestigious academic forum. When asked if he was deliberately mocking Schwerin with such a simplistic topic, Rowan calmly clarified his stance. Though telekinesis was a foundational spell, its inner workings were complex enough to merit a rigorous debate. Mako, however, dismissed that view. To him, dissecting such a basic spell was a waste of time. Rowan pushed back with quiet conviction. Wasn't it the duty of all mages to uncover truth, no matter how trivial or monumental it appeared? Eventually, Ollie Marco agreed to Rowan's proposal, if only to humor him and move on. Sensing Rowan's unfamiliarity with the format, Ollie condescendingly asked whether he wanted to hear the topic Schwerin had prepared. Believing himself to be vastly superior, Ollie proposed they debate the mechanics of Fireball. He made sure to note that the topic might be too difficult for someone Rowan's age, but in the spirit of generosity, he didn't mind punching down. Dean Arthur silently surmised that Schwerin may have caught wind of Rowan's Fireball incident and was trying to bait him into overextending. But Rowan flipped the script. Rather than fall for the trap, he offered to cover both spells, telekinesis and Fireball, as a combined topic. Exploring the intersection between the two, he reasoned, would make for a much more meaningful exchange. Without saying another word, Rowan picked up a piece of chalk with telekinesis and began writing his formula on the board, without a chant. It was a quiet flex, but a powerful one. Ollie, unwilling to be outdone, activated his own telekinesis and began scrawling formulas while muttering a chant to maintain the spell. All eyes, especially those of the Schwerin mages, locked onto the board, puzzled by Rowan's dense, intricate writing. It couldn't be, they thought. Was he really constructing a new spell to merge two established ones on the spot? As the initial formulas were finalized, both sides were invited to explain their reasoning. Ollie Marco went first. He presented the standard, separate formulas for telekinesis and Fireball. These spells, he stated, had been perfected since the days of the great mages. There was no room for recombination, they were complete, immutable. Then it was Rowan's turn. Standing before the audience, he began by breaking down the basics. Yes, telekinesis was a spell that even novices could cast. Initially, he had planned to critique its over-reliance on mana, but Ali's provocation had sparked a more ambitious idea: why not merge it with Fireball? Rowan's board now displayed a hybrid formula, one that allowed a mage to control a Fireball using the precision of telekinesis. And to illustrate the second part, he chose a demonstration. The chalk he'd been levitating began to spin faster and faster, its velocity building until heat and flame swirled around it. In just a few minutes, Rowan had created a technique to transform any object manipulated by telekinesis into a fiery projectile. Gasps filled the room. He had, for lack of a better phrase, deconstructed the foundations of magic itself, for fun. The Schwerin delegation stared in disbelief. Everything they had been taught was being challenged before their eyes. For many, especially those unfamiliar with Rowan's genius, it was nothing short of a mental gut punch. The older professors from Union Academy, however, were used to moments like this. They had long come to terms with the fact that Rowan wasn't just a natural talent, he was a force of nature. His knowledge, his analysis, his calm execution, all of it pointed to something far beyond his years. As the burning chalk floated beside him, Rowan continued to explain high-level concepts linking the two spells. His mastery wasn't just practical, it was theoretical. No one from Schwerin could keep up. Not the seniors. Not even Ollie Marco. Ollie, still clinging to his pride, tried to follow along, but each word Rowan spoke felt like a hammer to his ego. When Rowan wrapped up, he politely asked Ollie if there was anything he'd missed, anything deeper he had failed to grasp. Rowan's curiosity was genuine, but to Ollie, it felt like salt in a gaping wound. Ollie could neither understand nor replicate what he had just witnessed. The pressure mounted. Humiliation loomed. His breath quickened. Then, blood. A cough. A nosebleed. Ollie Marco collapsed on the spot, overwhelmed by sheer intellectual domination. Even Rowan hadn't expected that. Ollie was swiftly taken to the infirmary. Meanwhile, Rowan continued to dismantle the other Schwerin challengers, debating them one by one, his logic and spellcraft unshakable. By the end of the event, the outcome was clear: the Union's golden boy had gone undefeated. Bert, the senior Schwerin mage, graciously awarded Rowan the elixir, and thanked him for the incredible display. He also advised the boy to wait until graduation before consuming it. Drinking it too early could cause dangerous side effects. Rowan still had 2 years to go. Elsewhere on campus, another story unfolded. Rita, a third-year student just like Rowan, had been harboring feelings for him for 3 long years. She knew she wasn't alone. Every girl at Union Academy admired him. Half the incoming first years had applied just to be in his presence. And yet, she also knew that, in his eyes, she likely didn't exist. Still, today was different. Today, she would confess. After fighting past the fear that had held her back for years, she approached him with trembling resolve. Her words came out honest, if uncertain. But Rowan's reply was calm and apologetic. He gently explained that, to him, love was something different. It was not about admiration or butterflies. For him, love meant holding someone who had passed from this world close to his heart. That kind of love was deep, irrevocable, and haunting. He didn't dismiss her feelings, though. He asked if what she felt truly was love. Because true love, Rowan explained, often resembled madness. It brought joy, fear, longing, jealousy, pain, doubt, sometimes all at once. Could Rita really say she felt that for him? He suspected that what she felt was something else. Maybe nervousness. Maybe admiration. Maybe a bit of infatuation. And that was okay. But if she wanted to call it love, he simply asked her to take a good look inside her own heart. If she still believed it was love, he was open to having that conversation again. He wasn't trying to be cruel. He was just being Rowan, honest, logical, perhaps too much so. And so Rita, who had just confessed her heart to a boy she'd adored for 3 years, was turned down. It hurt. But it also cleared her mind. She walked away without regret. Because sometimes, saying what's in your heart is brave. Even if it ends in rejection. That was the day her one-sided love came to an end. And strangely, she had never felt stronger.